the way that voice in the World Bank and IMF is often thought about is often in terms of a tussle between G7 and emerging markets, and certainly with regards to quota reform, that has been the case. And it is quota and shareholding which leads to the outcome that we had earlier, where you talked about the executive director being executive director for 23 African countries, whereas others get to speak on their own. So there is a question about what African interests really are, and I think in addition to what the Ghanaian finance minister was saying, what Kenneth Oriato was talking about of our common humanity, I think the task for African think tanks, consultancies, and research organizations is to think about what are African interests without, number one, without taking into account anybody else, I'm sorry, and then trying to bring them in, okay? And that's partly because that's how history has worked, right? So we have the current inequity with quotas, and I'm going to use the IMF as an example because it's the easiest one, but you could do the similar analysis for the bank. Hanan talks about this. Germany's got 83 million people. We have on the African continent 1.4, but Germany has about the same size of quota as the African continent at the IMF. Germany also has plenty of finance to deal with its own development and to do plenty of quantitative easing to deal with a lot of things. So, that's the obvious one. Historically, the quotas were determined at a time, we always talk about the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions at a time of, coming out of the World War. Yeah, absolutely. But there were also a time when the UK and France between them had over 35 colonies. And they relied on those colonies to argue for those extra shares. They did. And the countries that were at the founding, India, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, who were founding members of these institutions, now have less shares than they did at that point. So there is, if you don't think about this from an African interest point of view, that's the outcome you get. It's also the outcome that you get with special drawing rights. Would we be talking about 100 billion special drawing rights of reallocation, several years after 650 billion reallocation, if there was a bigger quota for Africa? Africa got 33 billion in the first place. That's because of our quota share. So if you had a bigger quota for the African continent, we wouldn't really even be having the conversation. I mean, I'm sure Hassatu would still be talking about how do we have more reallocation into the African Development Bank, and definitely back that 100%. But it may not be the kind of issue that it was and that it still is. And it's also worth noting with the current proposals on the table from an extra seat around the IMF table for Africa, of course, very welcome. That would reduce it to 15, not 23. Great, excellent, good start. But also the idea of a capital increase. We just did some back of the envelope numbers on this. If you double the capital of the IMF, which I'm not sure that's a realistic thing to argue for, but let's say you did, the African continent, again, because of the way that the quota shares work, would get an extra 12 billion of quota shares. If you flip that and you say, well, what would happen? Oh, and by the way, the G20, the original G20, would get 160 billion special drawing rights if you did, quota shares if you did double the share of the IMF, the capital of the IMF. If you flip that and you thought, well, okay, what if you doubled the share, the quotas for the African continent instead? What would that lead to? And you kept everybody else kind of constant. You didn't play around with the formula necessarily, but you just doubled the share for Africa. You would get an extra 49 billion quotas to the continent. These are just back of the envelope numbers. We can double check them. But this is what I mean. It's quite a different kind of conversation and potential outcome if you think about these things from an African interest point of view. And I think that is what, giving this just one example of a particular policy issue, just one example of, if you think in that way, this is what the task is, to build on what the ministers have said, to build on what others have said. This is what the task is for now on all these different issues, to look at, we've got this architecture, but what is an African interest behind this architecture, and how can it deliver better? Even just the existing stuff.